Hello, and welcome to another week. Remember, the work week is a fiction, Monday doubly so. You can get rid of them if you really want to. This is Social Justice Alchemy. Agnosticism. Now, I'm not a fan of agnosticism, at least not as it's popularly used. The term originated back in the 19th century with Aldous Huxley in order to talk about things we don't know and can't know. Huxley was known as Darwin's bulldog, a fierce advocate for science generally and the scientific theory of evolution in particular. He coined agnostic and agnosticism in reference to a collection of religions and religious practices that were popular in the early centuries BC and AD, the Gnostics. They were mystics who believed that the way to enlightenment and perfection is through seeking out and learning various secret teachings. There's this evil material world and the perfect divine world, and by various mystical practices they could get access to the divine and thus achieve perfect knowledge of secret things. There's a lot more to agnosticism, but the core of the term comes from the Greek gnosis, knowledge. You can also find it in the Latin phrase noce te ipsum, or nosce te ipsum, know thyself. So Huxley just reached back through the centuries. The Gnostics were brutally suppressed by the churches in the West, though mystical tendencies and heresies naturally pop up everywhere. More so since the Reformation. He went back through the centuries to take the term, discard the baggage, and talk about something completely new. Gnosis means knowledge. Gnostic means one with knowledge. Agnosis means lack of knowledge. Agnostic, one without knowledge. Huxley meant it to describe his position in philosophy, probably with respect to metaphysics, the study of nature and reality. He seems to have come to the conclusion that the various philosophers in his day studying metaphysics were coming to unsupportable conclusions. Quote, they were quite certain they had attained a certain gnosis, had more or less successfully solved the problem of existence, while I was quite sure I had not, and had a pretty strong conviction that the problem was insoluble. End quote. The term, at least in my experience, is not much used today to describe a philosophical position with respect to any or all knowledge. Instead, it refers to the position one takes on the existence of a god or gods. The common understanding is that if you are certain there is a god, you are a theist. If you are certain there is no god, you are an atheist. If you are not certain either way, you are an agnostic. That is, those who call themselves agnostic, sometimes, not always, position themselves as morally or intellectually more honest than all those dogmatic believers, whether theist or atheist, who claim certainty about something where there can be no certainty. There's at least one amusing quip out there. Militant agnostic. I don't know, and neither do you. However, there are many more agnostics, and I think they're probably the majority, who just think of agnostic as meaning, I don't know, and are less strong about, I can't know. Rather than having a strong conviction that knowledge on the subject is impossible, it seems like they're just avoiding the confrontation and the uncomfortable label of atheist by saying, I'm not convinced there is a God, but I'm not convinced there is no God. Unfortunately for them, that makes them atheists. If you believe there's a God, if you're convinced for any reason, good or bad, and they're all bad, that some God exists, then you're a theist. If you are not convinced, if you don't believe, then you are an atheist. You don't have to be convinced that there is no God to be an atheist. A lot of atheists like to draw the distinction between being a hard atheist versus a soft atheist, or strong and weak, or positive and negative. Either way, the difference lies in which of these two statements you agree with. A, I do not believe that there is a God. B, I believe that there is no God. If you agree with both statements, you're a strong, positive, or hard atheist. You have been convinced, for whatever reason or reasons, that the proposition, some God exists, is false. If you only agree with the first question, you are a soft, weak, or negative atheist. You have lost, or just never had, the conviction that some God exists, but you have not been convinced in the other direction. Obviously, you can't agree with the second statement without agreeing with the first. If you don't agree with the first, that means that you do believe that there is God, and cannot then go on to agree with the second and affirm that you do believe that there is no God. That, by the way, is why they're called positive versus negative, or strong versus weak. The second statement is a positive statement, an affirmation. You're declaring that you do have a belief, that there is no God. The first statement is negative, a rejection of a claim, simply the declaration that you lack a belief. But even a negative atheist lacks that belief. If you do believe, you're a theist. If you don't, you are a theist, an atheist. Many skeptics, atheists, and science advocates today bend over backward to cede as much ground as possible to religion, so as to render their own position that much more defensible. We don't know, we can't know. Your claims to knowledge are false, not because your claims are false, but because you claim to know. I'm not denying your claims, I'm simply not accepting them. They're taking a position in negative atheism, and then rejecting the label of atheist. As with last week's discussion of skepticism and the failure to address popular religious topics, this is understandable but not all that noble. It's a matter of picking your battles versus you just don't want the negative attention. I get it, I just don't like it much. I also don't think it's correct. I don't think the reasons given are any good. The only reason to bend over backwards for religion is because we're afraid of its political, social, and economic power. Alright, those are big reasons. Still, I'm a cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied white man in his mid-30s from a wealthy family. I can do what I want. I fear not the overwhelming power of the Bronze Age bigoted blowhards that control 75% of our civilization. I might be a little afraid. Anyway, the stated reasons for giving religion every conceivable benefit of the doubt are garbage because they're wrong. Every religion ever has made definite claims not about things that exist beyond this reality and have absolutely no impact on this reality, but about things that exist in this reality, or that have an impact on this reality. Every religious believer is running around claiming to be a little God detector, in the words of Matt Dillahunty. They all claim that some version of a soul exists and is responsible for a person's actions. They all claim that multiple gods in various versions and varieties exist and actually do things in this world. Alright, that last one might get a few people to raise an objection. Christianity is a monotheism. It only believes in one God. Same for Islam. They don't believe in multiple gods. Check your definitions. What's the difference between a minor deity like Aeolus, keeper of the winds and ruler of a mythical floating island in Greek mythology, or Babi, Egyptian god of baboons, and the archangels Michael, Raphael, Gabriel, and Uriel, who stand at the four corners of the earth, because Christians were incredibly ignorant and believed in a flat earth hundreds of years after it was demonstrated to be spherical, and hold back the four winds. Catholic saints, Muslim jinn, angels, and demons in both. Monotheisms, these religions are not. Islam is a little less polytheistic, but with not having that nonsensical Trinitarian three things that are one thing but are still three completely different things, but whatever. Not really relevant. Anyway, all religions make claims about things actually acting in this world. If it has some sort of impact, we can measure that. If we look at a person's behavior, thought process, and the actual ways their physiology works, we absolutely should see the time and place where the soul intervenes. We should be able to detect the effect of some sort of god or demigod or spirit interacting with objects or brains or the body or what have you. No matter what, nothing is a one-way street. Going back to Newton, anything that is acted upon by a force responds with an equal and opposite reaction force. If the soul acts on the body acts on the soul. Unless the religious want to posit some entirely new branch of physics. And I gotta be honest, I've never seen any of them try that. However, we know that trying to put any sort of one-way street into your system causes it to break. If you want to have some class of items, S, that can interact with another class, P, but where class P can't interact with S, you're rapidly going to run into contradictions and inconsistencies. Basically, trying to build physics without Newton's third law is going to create a physical system that does not work. In other words, the religious conception of reality, A, cannot be studied only because the things they believe in never interact in any way with anything in this universe. B, cannot even exist because what they're proposing is fundamentally broken. Or C, can be studied because they don't want to pretend that they've invented a new kind of physics that no one has been able to figure out, even though they've tried. That's what theoretical physics is. Imagining wildly different physical laws and seeing what would happen. So, let's look at these three. A religious order that can't be studied because the items or beings involved never interact with reality. Okay, gotta be honest, that's an incredibly boring belief system. Heavy square quotes. What kind of jackass would argue for that kind of religion? Well, the sort of jackass who was afraid of being murdered by religious assholes, for one. It's called deism, and it was really popular in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries among educated individuals. Reject everything about religion except the absolute bare minimum. Just enough to get people to leave you alone. There are probably people who argue on behalf of some form of deism today, particularly in places where apostasy or atheism can be dangerous to your health. But really, it's not an interesting position. There's nothing to grab a hold of, nothing to argue for or against. It's a vacuous proposition. And let's be honest, anyone arguing on behalf of deism probably isn't arguing on behalf of the kind of hateful, hurtful bullshit you get out of people like white evangelicals, aka KKK, or Wahhabists. Anyone else will probably equivocate between the remaining two possibilities as needed. Yes, it has a real effect. No, you can't study it. What do you mean, why not? Screw you. Because. Shut up. Okay. What I mean is that a lot of them, most, nearly all, probably haven't put that much thought into it, and never considered that any phenomenon that impinges on reality can necessarily be studied, but quickly retreat to the position that they have a special kind of magical physics that you can't study because shut up. But it really needs to be hammered home. They have a massive uphill battle to demonstrate that their position is defensible. They either have to show that the phenomenon they're describing, gods, angels, demons, ghosts, souls, exist and can be studied, or they have to show the phenomenon they're describing exists, but can't be studied because of a physics system wildly different from the one we know exists. On the one hand, they have to provide the evidence that shows their stuff is real. On the other, they have to demonstrate that their new physics is real. Which, holy shit, that would be huge. No matter what we're talking about, the propositions of religion are necessarily subject to scientific investigation, because they're making claims about the nature of reality and the existence of things within it. The position of hard agnosticism, that it's impossible to study the claims of religion, is just false. The so-called supernatural, as something separate from nature and completely immune to investigation, is an incoherent concept. There is no way to have something completely separate from nature that can still interact with nature. Not even if it obeys some new set of physical laws, because those physical laws are still part of reality, still part of nature. And let me just repeat. The concept of supernatural is incoherent. There is no supernatural. There's only the natural, be it ever so unfamiliar. Another concept attached to agnosticism that I want to discuss is the distinction between belief and knowledge. For a while there, I agreed with the view held, as I vaguely recall, by Matt Dillahunty of the Atheist Experience. I used to watch/listen to the show, a live call-in YouTube channel that takes questions and debates from atheists or theists. But the thing is, believers don't have new arguments. They never had good arguments, and the well for new arguments dried up pretty much as soon as people started coming up with arguments. So what I'm saying is the show got repetitive. I stopped watching. The show's a very valuable resource for new non-believers. It provides a deep well for answering the apologetics, good or bad, offered by the callers, and it provides a window into a community of non-believers for people who might feel very, very lonely in their non-belief. And Dylan Hunty is one of the regular hosts of the show, or was, and the conversations on the show frequently turn to knowledge versus belief, because a common religious tactic is to try and argue that, 1, you don't know for absolutely certain that there is no God, 2, therefore you don't know either way, 3, therefore you're not really an atheist, therefore, 4, somehow you have to admit that I'm right, 5, I don't know, it just sort of falls apart, 6, they're just trying to prove that atheists aren't real for some reason. Anyway, Dillahunty used to have a position that I used to agree with, though he may have changed it since then, that knowledge is a form of belief. That knowledge is verifiable, true belief. What changed my mind about this is the inclusion of true. How can you determine if something is true? Well, it has to be verifiable. That's what verifiable means, that we can determine that it's true. But tagging true on there as a separate thing, in addition to verifiable, is only meaningful if we have some special way to find out what's true, from the outside. That would be the only way to distinguish between a verifiable true belief, knowledge, and a verifiable but false belief. Some sort of reasonable not knowledge. So, discard true and you're left with verifiable. Okay. Claims that you can test and prove to be true. Well, no one believes that their beliefs are unjustified or unverifiable. Every person is convinced of the things they believe, for whatever reason, or they wouldn't believe them. Even beliefs held on faith. The faithful think those are justifiable, verifiable, true beliefs. They're wrong, but that's what they believe. Many of them even call those beliefs knowledge. Even if you only have very little justification for your belief, very little evidence or confidence, even if you only call it suspicion or a hunch, or something, you still have some justification or rationalization. You still have, or believe you have, some good reason for that belief. And it will still be verifiable, even if you're not willing to go to the effort or expense of verifying it for yourself. That's why my position has changed. I no longer think that knowledge is belief plus truth. Now I think that knowledge is belief plus confidence. What a person considers knowledge, rather than mere belief, is a matter of emotional conviction, and isn't based on any sort of systematic classification using evidence, reason, verification, or truth. And that's my more philosophical rejection of agnosticism. My more emotional attack is that it smacks of cowardice, or prudence if you're being kind, and isn't based on a conviction that knowledge is unavailable. This attack is just that knowledge isn't really a thing. We just have beliefs, some of which are more or better justified. Distinguishing knowledge from belief is what is impossible because they're the same thing. And that's why I reject the category of agnostic. You can't say, I don't know, but I believe, and call it a separate category. It's just admitting a lack of confidence in your belief. And saying that you don't think others can know is saying you don't think others can have good justifications for their beliefs, which means you don't believe. You might not be a strong or positive atheist, but you'll still be an atheist. TERF, Trans-Exclusionary Radical Feminism. SWERF, Sex Worker Exclusionary Radical Feminism. Although douchebags on the right call every feminist radical, being a radical feminist places you within a specific branch of feminism that arose back during the second wave in the 60s and 70s. The first wave of feminism was in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and secured the right to vote. The second wave was in the 60s and 70s and brought women into the workplace. And the third wave is attempting to secure social equality and integrate it into the broader context of social justice right now. Radical isn't just a term from California surfer culture. Personally, I was always much more familiar with it as a term within chemistry, where it refers to an atom or compound with an unpaired, and thus highly reactive, electron. In other contexts, radical comes from the Latin radix, root, and anything radical is attacking or identifying the root cause of something. Radical feminists, therefore, identify themselves as such in order to distinguish themselves from other feminist movements. They identify the root cause of women's oppression as arising from the gendered expectations of patriarchal social structures rather than in the government, liberal feminism, or economic class, Marxist feminism. Radfems claim that society as a whole is organized for the benefit of men and to the detriment of women, that men as a whole oppress and subjugate women. In broad strokes, this is true, as are the claims of liberal feminism that government institutions act to give men advantages over women, and those of Marxist or socialist feminism that capitalist institutions give men advantages over women. However, radical feminists claim that the social patriarchal structures are the fundamental root, the true origin, and that government and economic structures arise from that basic attack on women's dignity. Since socialist and liberal feminists agree with one another but that both government and economic institutions contribute to women's oppression, but differ on which is more important, radical feminists called themselves that to state that they were declaring social norms the real problem, the root cause. I want to note, radical feminists aren't wrong to attack patriarchy in social institutions. The gendered and regressive expectations placed on women give them severe disadvantages and force them to struggle their entire lives and generally to experience worse outcomes in all their endeavors. However, government and economics are part of culture. They are culture. These systems are all integrated in different ways, and attacking one is attacking all of them. And radfems usually do. From what I've pieced together, please note I'm not a feminist scholar nor a historian of feminism, radfems usually hold a number of very mainstream feminist views, such as wanting to expand reproductive rights and to improve women's equality generally. However, some radfems are just weird. Blaming women's oppression not just on a larger culture that advantages men at the expense of women, but blaming individual men. Some radfems take ordinary feminist discourse in weird directions or to extreme conclusions. For example, more typical feminist discourse will note that video porn is largely produced by men for men, and thus focuses on male pleasure and the pleasure of the male viewing experience, reducing women to objects serving the male gaze. The feminist response will include condemning mainstream porn for excluding and degrading women, and then can go on to either condemn porn in and of itself, or it can advocate a broader, more inclusive, and healthier form of pornography, where women aren't merely bodies present for the pleasure of men, but are active and pleased participants themselves, where women aren't just participants in the production, but are part of the intended audience, and so on. Radfems, meanwhile, will usually take the first route, condemning pornography, full stop. A number of them take it even further. Not only do they attack pornography as objectifying and degrading women and leading to violence against them, they likewise attack marriage as doing the same. Don't get me wrong, many feminists dislike marriage as practiced in the United States as constrictive, restrictive, and unhealthy, especially for women. But as that especially notes, they'll point out that it's also constrictive, restrictive, and unhealthy for men. Noting that men are restricted and isolated by patriarchy and forced into unhealthy roles that harm them as well as women is one of the things that makes feminism awesome, and always has done. Some radfems will then go on to say that all heterosexual sex is patriarchal and benefits men at women's expense. Others view sex as mainly in terms of its utility for reproduction, and the role sexual reproduction plays in forcing women into certain social roles, mothers, and out of the workforce, limiting their freedom and making them into servants of men, specifically, in society more broadly. Either way, you can get some weird radfems who insist that all heterosexual sex is sexual violence against women, that it isn't possible to have an uncoercive heterosexual relationships, that any sex between a man and a woman is rape. You can even get a branch of radfems who so remove themselves from men that they embrace radical political lesbianism. The idea that sexual orientation is a choice and women should become lesbians until they achieve true equality. Some will even argue that the use of a dildo is sexual violence because it recreates the norms and expectations of the patriarchy and turns one of the women into a pseudo-man raping the other. Other radfems just argue for celibacy and say that abandoning heterosexuality is an unfortunate necessity. This is, at least in part, the origin of SWERFs, sex worker exclusionary radical feminists. In theory, radfems are opposed to prostitution, cam work, and porn because it recreates oppressive social institutions that hurt women. In practice, at least some radfems today often target sex workers for harassment, abuse, or even assaults or threats of the same. By contrast, a large segment of third-wave feminism is dedicated to supporting sex workers, eliminating oppressive and harmful practices. They recognize that sex is awesome, and sex work is, at the very least, just another job, or could even be a really awesome thing that improves society. See, for example, the powerful economic or religious positions sex workers have held in the distant past. Radfems also take positions on gender and being trans. They're as divided here as they are elsewhere, with some radfems being open and inclusive, others being bigoted and exclusive, hence TERF, trans exclusionary radical feminism. Just FYI, very, very few people actually claim the titles of TERF or SWERF. Most view those as slurs and try to report people who use them as abusers or bigots themselves on YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter. They are, however, fairly straightforward descriptive labels, applying to people for their expressed ideologies, radical feminism and bigotry against trans people and sex workers, and for their openly claimed titles, radical feminism, again. TERFs assert that gender is purely a function of biology, that you are the plumbing you were born with, that social roles are social roles, but there's still something fundamental about biology. Like conservative Christian bigots, they say you are born an XY male with male dangles, or an XX female with a female dimple. They claim that, having been born male and lived male, trans women have lived with male privilege and cannot actually understand what it is to be a woman. That claim, depending on how it's expressed, can at least be modified to fit within trans-inclusive feminism. No, trans women haven't lived as women their whole lives. They don't know what it is to be born, raised, and live fully as cis women. But they do have the experience of being a trans woman living as a man, being a trans woman living in transition, or a trans woman living as a woman. But TERFs reject the notion that gender is separate from plumbing, but still biological or anything, that the human brain is a complex organ. They say there's no internal female identity, or female essence, or female brain, or anything like that. There's only chromosomes and genitalia. They call themselves gender essentialists rather than TERFs. They go on to claim that trans women are men attempting to invade female space, to steal and degrade the concept and experience of female oppression, thus weakening the feminist argument somehow, and possibly to assault and rape real women. TERFs are fucking assholes. Full stop. These last few paragraphs have focused largely on TERFs and their bigotry toward trans women. As with the broader U.S. culture, the TERF conversation around trans people tends to focus on trans women. Just as Christian bigots focus on trans women going into women's spaces to attack and degrade women, bathroom bills, TERFs focus on trans women coming into feminist spaces to do the same. The hypothesis or model among gender theorists, as I understand, again, not an expert, is that bigots fully understand the desire of a woman to call herself a man, but a man trying to call himself a woman triggers cognitive dissonance. That is, trans men are easy for bigots to understand because men are seen as better or of higher status than women. They don't actually understand trans men because trans men aren't trying to achieve higher social, political, or economic status. They're just trying to live their fullest, happiest, best, most honest lives as whoever they truly are. But for the bigots, trans women are moving down the ladder, seeking a lower status in society. Once you understand that this is something trans women have to do because it's who they truly are, it's not a problem. But for the bigots, it's a huge brain fuck. They have this rigid, hierarchical worldview that they refuse to modify. Hey, sociologists, neurologists, is this a brain thing, or can we actually improve society to the point that this sort of person doesn't happen anymore? Anyway, this rigid hierarchy refuse to modify, and so they can only support that view by coming to the conclusion that trans women are men who are trying to get some sort of advantage. Since women are lower status, it can't be an advantage in the broader culture, except insofar as right-wing bigots believe that claiming victim status lets you get away with stuff. So they must be trying to attack women. At this point, you've almost certainly noticed that I've talked about right-wingers, conservatives, and Christians a few times. TERFs and SWERFs on the one hand, Republicans on the other, are natural allies on a lot of issues. In fact, I have heard that a significant fraction of early radfems were Catholic nuns, of all things. Now, I heard this several years ago, and my Google foo has completely failed to turn up anything relevant, so this might have been a single author's opinion, or it might have just been part of Pope Francis's attack on Catholic nuns from a few years back. I don't know. What I recall was that Catholic nuns wanted a piece of the feminist pie. The Catholic Church, of course, has always been ridiculously misogynistic. And nuns, like most Catholic women, want a larger voice and place in the hierarchy. Not all forms of feminism are a natural fit for that, but somehow, apparently, radical feminism worked. Maybe because it changes its emphasis from political and economic institutions over to culture? In any event, this might help to inform the strand of right-wing bigotry that has woven itself into parts of radical feminism. The Catholic hierarchy is very gender essentialist. Male and female made he them, woman is helpmeet, so on. And there's a brand of Christianity more generally that calls itself complementarian, where women and men are separate but equal, having completely different roles. Radical feminists reject the idea of different roles, but accept the idea of women and men as different, that gender essentialism. Like I said, a lot of TERFs call themselves gender essentialists. So TERFs have found a middle ground there, working with Christian bigots to attack trans folk. There's also a group of right-wing bigots who style themselves as second-wave feminists, who like to talk about how feminists used to be okay, but now it's all about claiming victimhood and attacking men and blah blah blah. They're not feminists. Some are just parroting old feminist talking points in order to distort them and attack feminism on behalf of a right-wing agenda. See, for example, Christina Hoff Sommers, a far-right bigot employed by the Koch brothers through the American Enterprise Institute. Others are just ignorant little shits who don't even realize how much feminism has done for them, who accept a large amount of feminist thought without noticing that it deeply conflicts with their far-right bigotry, like racist terrorist Lauren Southern. In any event, TERFs and SWERFs are happy to work with right-wing bigots because their own bigotry, at least in the areas of trans politics and sex politics, so often match. TERFs hate trans women, Republicans hate trans women, and they cooperate to put together laws to discriminate against trans women. The TERFs provide the Republicans with cover because they get to say they talked to feminists who helped them write their bills. And the Republicans provide the TERFs with money. Lots and lots of money. Republicans are really good at getting rich people to foot the bill for bigoted mouthpieces, because that's how Republican fascism works. 1, promise rich people to get more rich. In response, the rich people give Republicans money. 2, they promise poor people that the people they hate will be punished. So the rich people then pay a few bigots to spread lies and propaganda talking to poor bigots. Poor bigots then vote Republican. 3, Republicans pass laws. Always laws that give money to the rich. Sometimes laws that punish the targets of bigotry. So, if not for their alliance with the fascist Republican Party, the absolutely minuscule movement that is bigoted radical feminism would have died out long ago, because they are minuscule. By far, the majority of feminists aren't TERFs or SWERFs. Okay? The portions of radical feminism that were correct have largely migrated into mainstream feminism, leaving bigotry, attacks on individual men, and things like that out in the cold. Now, again, this is all the understanding of a dude who hasn't dedicated years to gender studies and hasn't done a survey of the field to find the size of various groups within it. I have links down in the thingy for those who want to learn more, and I do encourage you to do a lot of reading, because feminism is a large and diverse movement with lots of focuses and lots of different analyses and forms of analysis. Either way, fuck TERFs. Fuck SWERFs. They're assholes. They make life a living hell for people. They love to target people for harassment and abuse. And if you see anything like that, I encourage you to find some way to stop it. Whether it's in meat space, go ahead and just get in their way. Physically step in front of them. Stop them from attacking whoever they're attacking. And online, report their harassment and abuse. It won't do much good, but you can try. Nope, no news this week. I spent too long, waxing something about agnosticism, TERFs and SWERFs and so on, so no news. That's it for this week in Social Justice Alchemy. I've been your alchemist, John Brockman. If you want to yell at me, argue with me, or tell me how much you like me, you can, like, share, subscribe, and leave positive reviews on iTunes and so on. Or you can track me down at the Social Justice Alchemy YouTube channel. You can leave comments there. Or you can hunt down the blog where I post the transcripts for these things. That's surgoshan.blogspot.com. That's SURGOSHAN, blogspot.com. If you're looking for something a little more lighthearted, you can find me on another podcast, the Dungeons and Debacles podcast. That's a Dungeons and Dragons podcast hosted by my friend and Dungeon Master Kevin, where a group of us are technically not good and are looking to unleash an ancient evil to alter the paradigm. Anyway, it's a lot of fun. And thank you for listening. I'll see you next week.